GM Matt Klentak has kind of been living in anonymity. I mean, is anybody paying attention to what they're doing? Is anybody saying, hey, that Klentak, that move really was a good one? Or, man, that move was really a lousy one. It seems that he's just making moves and doing things, but no one's really paying attention.
A lot of focus on the Sixers GM situation, a lot of focus on the Flyers and their GM and what they're doing. You're right. That Klentak not as much in that white-hot spotlight of what are you doing right now.
Mike Sielski writes about that at Philly.com. The Inquirer columnist joins us now, and he says Matt Klentak shows he's more than just a stereotype as he's working to get this Phillies back to really, Mike, they were the number one team in town there for a couple of years. They were right there with the Eagles 1-1A, and now they're kind of just there, and Klentak is leading the charge here, but I don't know that anybody's really paying attention to what he's doing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think they kind of like it that way. I think they're happy to kind of work in anonymity just for right now in the hopes that the prospects that they have and the young players who are already up will grow and develop and, you know, become something that people can get excited about. But until then, I think they're pretty content to just kind of do their work in the shadows and hope that things work out.
Yeah, and when he came over here, I don't know that people were excited about it, but there's one thing was for sure, they wanted the other guy gone, right? They wanted the other guy out of here no matter what. But Klentak, not a popular choice, not an awful choice, not a hated choice. So as you kind of mentioned, the Phillies are probably happy that the spotlight's off their organization during these downtimes because that doesn't happen in Philadelphia all that much. When you're not playing well, there's usually an opinion about you.
Yeah, and it breaks from what we have seen with the Eagles and from what we have tended to see over time with the Flyers, which is to say that the Phillies didn't go about trying to win the offseason in any regard. You know, the Eagles have done that a lot over the last few years where they have gone through these summers of upheaval and springs of upheaval, whether it's the dream team of 2011 or hiring Chip Kelly in 2013 and all the changes he made in 2015 and then trading up to get Carson Wentz and then signing Alshon Jeffrey and Torrey Smith this season. You know, they always win the offseason, but they haven't won any playoff games since 2008. And then you get the Flyers and you know, they had been on the phrase I like to use, the orange and black hamster wheel for basically 40 years and, you know, have finally kind of slowed things down. Now, I think that may change this offseason, you know, given what happened this year and the improvements that they're going to need to make. But, yeah, I think the Phillies are content to kind of just sit back and let, you know, the whole thrust of what they're trying to do is to let things play out. So they're content to let things play out and see where the chips fall.
Mike Sielski with us. Mike, what impressed you about Klentak that maybe people should start to take notice of?
You know, I think, Pete, that in today's age of baseball, it's very easy to, and this is kind of what I wrote about in the piece that Mike referenced, it's very easy to pigeonhole a young GM, and Klentak's only, 37, I think, as just a numbers guy or a, you know, sabermetric guy, a Moneyball guy. And some of the things that he's done have interestingly kind of broken from that, you know, going out and getting Howie Kendrick and Michael Saunders, not just to improve the lineup, but under the guise of, hey, look, we need some real professional hitters in this lineup, not just to improve the offense, but so that guys in the clubhouse have other guys who are playing every day and producing every day who they can go to for advice and insight and just that kind of veteran presence. It's an intangible thing that you don't hear much of. You know, to me, the fact that they kept Brock Stassi on the roster was an interesting move, not just because Stassi had played so well and his backstory and, you know, all the stuff that everybody loves about him now, but the fact that they went out and got Chris Coughlin specifically to be a bench bat. And they said, you know what? Brock Stassi outplayed him, and we think Brock Stassi can do what Chris Coughlin would have done. And what message does it send to the rest of the organization that when a guy, if you don't have a roster spot for a guy who has done everything right, done everything we've asked him to do, and he still loses his spot to the guy that you just brought in. So I think there are some intangible kind of things there that I think are interesting from Klentak, and I'm curious to see you know, how he progresses, how he grows and develops as GM as the years go by.
Is the hire of Klentak a clear indication that the Phillies old boy network, so to speak, is no longer there, or at least it's been diminished?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, symbolically anyway, you know, you had the death of Dallas Green 2 weeks ago, and that kind of ended that era, symbolically. I don't mean that Dallas died symbolically. I mean that the era of the Phillies' old way of doing things kind of symbolically ended with his death. That idea that you rely first and foremost on a scout's eyesight to determine whether a hitter's swing has come back to him, or just the old school ways of doing things. There's some merit to that way of doing it, and it was very good to the Phillies in the late 70s and early 80s, and throughout the early 2007 to 2011. But things have changed, and they needed to update the way they looked at the game and thought about the game. And I think Klentak represents a pretty clear break from that past.
Mike Sielski is with us from Philadelphia Inquirer. Read this piece about Matt Klentak, because we talk a lot about him in the last couple of days here, in that the GMs in this town are so high profile. Everybody's constantly judging them, and Klentak is kind of living under the radar here a little bit. But how would you describe his his view of how to build a baseball team? We had the Hinkie era there, where he viewed of grabbing assets and trying to constantly draft high. You got Colangelo, who's a little bit more wanting to bring the veteran pieces in. You got Hextall, who's preaching patience over there. You got Roseman, who doesn't want the Band-Aid and then signs 2 Band-Aids. What is Matt Klentak's view of how to build a winning club?
I think he takes a lot of different things into consideration. I think, he's modern from the standpoint that he is looking very much to, in a Hinkie way of doing it, I guess, kind of hoarding and collecting as many possible prospects as he can. That's one of the interesting things about where the Phillies are right now, is that if things go as well as possible for them, they're going to be full of happy problems. If Cesar Hernandez and Freddie Galvis, continue to hit well and play well over the course of the season, well, then what do? Do you still bring up J.P. Crawford? Do you trade, one of those 3 guys? What do you do with Scott Kingery? The other second base prospect who they're very high on. What about Valentin, the kid who impressed so much at spring training? Same thing with the outfield. What are we going to see from Roman Quinn at AAA? What are we going to see from Nick Williams at AAA? At what point do we move on from those guys, or move them up to the big leagues, I should say? And even a guy like Saunders, he's got a club option for next season. If he hits well and plays well and fits in well, would the Phillies consider keeping him? So from that standpoint, he's Hinkie-like in that he's given himself a lot of options. It doesn't mean everything's going to work out, but the goal is to kind of mitigate the damage if Aaron Nola, for instance, blows out his elbow or doesn't pitch well. And then in terms of being a little more traditional, I think, like I said, he does look at the intangible a little bit more than a Hinkie does. He was a baseball player at Dartmouth. I mean, he was a Division I player, so he has an appreciation and a sense for the things you can't coach and can't teach, and maybe kind of go unseen on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's something that he brings to the table as well.
Mike Sielski with us, and I'm glad you brought Dartmouth up, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. Take us through the process of Mike Sielski, Inquirer columnist, and how anybody can look up and see that he went to Dartmouth. How do you find out that he wrote an independent study on the meaning and validity of the phrase "in the zone"? How do you discover that? And then where's the light bulb go on? Like, wait a second, this could be my launching off point of the profile of Matt Klentak.
Well, I'd done an extensive interview with him last year about his time at Dartmouth and its impact and influence on the way he thought about things as a general manager. And in the course of talking to him, I asked him about whether he, we got to talking about, kind of not hot, but kind of think thoughtful discussion topics throughout sports. And one of them is the idea of, is any player really clutch? How do you get the label of being a clutch player? What made Derek Jeter a quote-unquote clutch player, and was he actually a clutch player? And he told me, he said, I actually believe in that. I do believe that there's such a thing as a clutch player and a guy who can rise to the moment. And I actually did an independent study about it while I was at Dartmouth, and we talked at length about it, and he was very open about it. And it's one of the things I kind of like about him, is that he brings different things to the table. He's not what you would look at or read about and say, there's a baseball guy, but that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just that there's a lot to him, as a collegiate player, as an Ivy Leaguer, as an economics major, as somebody who spent a lot of time in baseball, since he's, got out of being an undergrad. So I think even though we don't hear from him a lot, there's a lot under the surface there. And I think he would do well in this market to let people see more of it, because I think fans in Philadelphia like to feel like they're along for the ride. They like to feel like they know the people who are running their teams and playing for their teams. And so, I think for his sake, he would do well to make himself more public because people like that.
Yeah, that kind of leads me into my question I had for you, which was, does his personality fit? You know how it is here, and does that even matter anymore? I mean, as you said, he would do well to speak. Sam at the end of his tenure started to speak more. I had him on and I said, Sam, you're pretty good at this. You should do it more. And he kind of laughed, but that's not his personality. It seems that Klentak's similar, where he doesn't love being out in front. But does that matter anymore with that job? Because it seems that everybody else is constantly everybody wants to talk to him. You got to get Colangelo out there. You got to get Howie out there. You got to get Hextall out there.
I think it matters more, Mike, if your team is not doing as well. I think you can build up goodwill if you are open and accessible, and people will give you a longer rope. I think that was part of the reason. That was kind of part of what sank Hinkie here. Every time I've talked to him, and I know him fairly well, I thought he was smart. I liked him. I thought he had a lot to say. Like you, whenever he spoke publicly, I thought he handled himself really well and gave intelligent answers. And I would talk to him about it the same way you did. Like, why don't you do this more? It would go a long way to helping yourself. And he didn't feel it was something he wanted to do. He didn't want to give away trade secrets, that sort of thing. So to answer your question, I think if the Phillies make major strides this year, or significant strides, and look like they're pointed in the right direction, it's not going to matter whether Matt Klentak goes on a talk radio station or gives a sit-down interview with a sports writer or anything like that. I think the team's record and performance will speak for himself. But I think the flip side is, if and the touchstone example of this always is Buddy Ryan. Buddy Ryan, from a coaching standpoint, might be the most overrated coach in the history of Philadelphia sports, but people love him for the way that he carried himself and spoke in public, and all those sorts of things. So it gave him a longer rope with the public than he might have otherwise got. Hey,
Mike, what is Klentak's perception of maybe himself or this job, or where this team is right now? Does he understand that there's this is going to be 5 years now that the team is removed from a playoff appearance, which in this town, like the baseball team, not to make the playoffs, it seems like, well, that never happened, but it's pretty recent that they were consistently making the playoffs. So when does the perception of him, of when he feels he's going to start feeling some heat?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. And I think he probably perceives that differently from the rest of us do. Your question gets me thinking about an anecdote I read in a profile of Theo Epstein, Cubs president and general manager. ESPN the magazine did a big story about him last year in the run-up to the Cubs winning the World Series. And there was an anecdote in that piece about how in his first or second year as their GM, the Cubs were having a terrible year. They were only going to win, I forget what it was, 55, 60, 65 games. They were just awful. But they were Epstein and his assistants and his right-hand men were one day cheering in their offices because one of their minor league teams had won a championship or set an organizational record for victories. And they knew that the guys who were coming were going to be great at the major league level. They knew they had done something right. And even though at the surface everybody was saying, boy, the Cubs are awful and Theo's got his work cut out for him, they kind of knew implicitly that things were turning around. So I'm sure Klentak will feel the heat if the Phillies don't play well this year. But I also have to think that at some level he's looking beneath the surface and saying, okay, well, how's Nick Williams doing? How's Roman Quinn? What does Kingery look like at Double-A? How do those young arms look at Double and Triple-A? And while we may not be very interested in the Phillies right now, based on just this season, I got to think he and the people within the organization are looking at this from a different perspective.
That's interesting that you brought that up, because we opened up opening day by asking that very question. Like, people are excited about the Sixers because they deem players on that roster that are championship talents. Do the Phillies have those guys, even though they have a lot of young pieces? Is one of those guys the one that you say that's the pitcher that will be able to lead them through a playoff, series? A Cole Hamels, like that is where I wonder. Yeah, they accumulated a lot, but do they have that over the top player currently?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think Vince Velasquez has. I think they perceive him to having that potential. If he can become a starter and kind of, master the art of getting through, 6 or 7, 8 innings with, minimal pitches as opposed to trying to strike everybody out. And they don't have a Mike Trout, obviously. Nobody does. And I don't know that they have anybody right now you look at and say, there's a superstar on the way. But, you don't necessarily need one or two superstars to win a World Series. You need a team that up and down does what it's supposed to do on a night in and night out basis. Look at the Kansas City Royals. They waited a while for some of their really good prospects to mature and develop, and they became a team that, came within a couple of outs of winning back-to-back World Series. So I think that's kind of how the way they're looking at it. And look, Franco's got a lot of potential. Herrera has a lot of potential. I think the first few months are going to be a great revealer, in terms of what is J.P. Crawford doing at AAA? What is Nick Williams doing down there? What is Roman Quinn doing down there? What's happening at the major leagues? And how soon can the Phillies start to speed up this process where the guys that everybody is waiting for finally get their chance at the highest level?
We're spending a few minutes with Mike Sielski, the columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, Philly.com. And, Mike, you wrote about Odubel Herrera, and you just brought him up a minute ago, and the chance that he has to become an elite hitter. Do you see him then as the guy the Phillies do want to build around, or do they view him as that kind of player?
I think they do, but by the same token, Pete, I think they did a very smart thing by giving him the contract and getting him to agree to the kind of contract that he agreed to. It's 5 years, $30 million. It's not so expensive and onerous that if something were to happen, if he were not to be the player, that or the hitter that they thought he could be, or they felt like, there was a chance to make a major move to get, a key piece, a superstar, a top of the rotation starter, whatever the case may be, they could move on from him if they wanted to. But I think at this point they recognize that this guy, through his first 2 years with them, has been, has gone from a Rule 5 guy to, somebody who has the capability to be a top to middle of the order bat for them. I like him. I look at him and I see the kind of hitter from a stylistic standpoint who could conceivably win a batting title or be the kind of guy who hits between 290 and 320, every single year, with 15 to 20 homers and a bunch of doubles and just a productive guy. And I think the key for him is, continuing to be disciplined at the plate in the way he improved last year. I mean, he took a quantum leap in terms of, walks and on-base percentage and things like that. It was really kind of striking. So if he can continue on that arc, I think he can be a terrific part of, whatever this team is going to be in the years to come.
All right, Mike Sielski, Philly.com. Mike, of the teams right now, we always ask this question, but who do you feel best that has the best leadership? Matt Klentak, you just did that piece on, Colangelo, Hextall, Roseman. Who do you trust most?
Boy, that's a really, really tough question, Mike. I think the Sixers have things fairly well set up for them, assuming Embiid and Simmons are healthy. I mean, that's the big roll of the dice. I don't worry. I'm not thrilled with everything Brian Colangelo has done, but, having Simmons and Embiid and assuming they're healthy, you're in pretty good shape. I still feel like the Eagles are kind of going about things with their hair on fire a little bit for all the talk about being patient that Jeffrey Lurie offered last week at their owners' meetings. I still feel like they are, what they're doing doesn't quite line up with what they're saying. Ron Hextall has been patient, and I think that's a good thing. I'm a little less sanguine about some of the trades and moves that he's made. I really think this is a big offseason for him and for the franchise. They have some hard decisions to make, I think, about guys who are core players and whether they should stay around to see if this rebuild actually comes to fruition. And right now I like what the Phillies are doing. I like the fact that they're not getting over their skis in terms of, spending money that they don't need to spend. They're gearing up and waiting for the, next off season when some really big free agents hit the market. They're going to have money to spend then. Even the moves that have kind of sort of blown up in their face, a la, the Jeremy Hellickson thing. Okay, so you end up spending $17 million on 1 year for Jeremy Hellickson. He's a pretty good pitcher. He was good for you last year. He was good on opening day. I think he'll be solid all year. There are worse things. So, gun to my head, I would say right now the Flyers and the Phillies, with the Phillies maybe a little bit ahead.
All right, Mike Sielski, read that piece on Matt Klentak, because we've talked a lot on this show that he's just kind of hanging out in anonymity. You'll learn more about him in Mike's piece over at Philly.com. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.